Hi, it's Maya here with my January wrap-up. Let's get right into the books, and the first book I read was A Stranger in Olondria by Sophie Samatar. This book is so beautifully written that I'm not at all surprised that it won the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel in 2014. And it's pretty difficult to believe that this is Samatar's debut novel. So I didn't know a lot about the book when I went into it. I knew it was about a young man who visits another country that he's wanted to visit for a long time. The main character is called Chevik, and he lives in his father's pepper farm and has lived there for all of his life. It starts with Chevik being a young boy. His father goes on these yearly spice selling trips, so Chevik hears a lot about Olondria. And one time his father comes back with a tutor for Chevik, and the tutor teaches him to read and write in Olondrian. This is a pretty big deal for Chevik since there is no written language in his own language. So he grows up hearing about the wonders of Olondria, and when he's older he finally gets the chance to visit the city of Bane. Now this is the one thing that I really liked about the book, is when Chevik visits Bane and the sense of wonder that he feels seeing all these new sights and walking around the beautiful city and visiting bookshops. He's never seen a bookshop before or library. And I think the book just captured very well that feeling of traveling in another country and seeing something beautiful that you weren't expecting at all. For example, it reminded me of my own trip to Rome when I turned a corner and saw the Fontana di Trevi. In addition to these beautiful travel descriptions, the world is really built by stories. There are people telling stories many times in this book, and it really manages to make the world seem old and deep, like there's so much history behind it, there's so much that we are not told. And this really brings a depth to the world. The writing style is very atmospheric and there are these long descriptions, and because of that, the book is best read in long doses. It takes a bit of concentration to delve back into the world. So I couldn't have read this book in small doses, for example, while on the bus or something. It always took me a couple of paragraphs to get into the flow and really experience what was going on. Where the plot went for me was very unexpected. I wasn't expecting that at all. I hadn't read the back cover text before I started reading it. It was very unexpected, but for me the plot wasn't the most important part of the book. I love the weight of history and the descriptions, and I'd really be interested if you are a more plot-centered reader to know what you felt about the book. The book is really about a love of travel, love of books, love of stories, love of literacy. I was really expecting to give this book 5 stars, but during the end I sort of fell out of the enchantment. I think this might have been because I finished reading the book while I had the flu, so I wasn't able to concentrate. Like I said before, the book really required a good deal of concentration to be able to really get into the story. So I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book I read was The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. I read the Finnish translation from this bind-up that I own. And I haven't read this series before, so this is the first time of me reading it. And I was a little disappointed. I really liked the first book, Oversea Under Stone, and I was expecting a great deal from The Dark is Rising because I heard that it's a lot of people's favorite from the series. But I think I would have enjoyed it more if I had read it as a kid. So this is a story about a young boy called Will who learns that he's one of the old ones, these immortal beings, and that he must find the 6 signs of light and beat back the darkness during the winter holidays. So this book takes place from the winter solstice to the 12th night. And this is a time when the darkness has the most power and is trying to rise. Now the reason why I didn't much care for this was that Will sort of walks through the story, things happen around him, things happen to him, and things that he's supposed to do sort of just fall into his lap. The main character pretty much doesn't do anything. And the reason I think I would have liked this as a kid was because there's some great mythical imagery, and there's some very striking scenes that would have captured me as a kid, and I perhaps wouldn't have paid that much attention to the amount of stuff that Will actually ends up doing. So I gave this one 2.5 or 3 stars about there, and I am planning to continue with the series. I do have the rest of the books in this and another bind-up. The next book I finished was Ancillary Mercy by Ann Leckie. This is the 3rd and final book in the Imperial Raj trilogy. I read this together with Ottavio from the Galilean Library. I really enjoyed this book, I really enjoyed the whole series, and this tells about an AI called Breck who used to have a lot of bodies, but she now only has one left. And it's about her sort of quest for vengeance and also about her getting used to only living in one body. But it's sort of a very calm book in that a lot happens in it, but it's also about these interpersonal relationships. And I still love all the characters in this book, and there are also a couple of new characters that are a very interesting addition to the series. Breck seems to be able to pick up these strays in every book. Now I'm not going to talk a lot about this since it's the final book, I'm just going to say that I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars out of 5. There was a little bit of a lull for me quite near the end. I don't know if that was because my reading brain was tired because I read a huge chunk of this book in one day and it was quite late when I finished it. And there was also a little part that I thought was a bit skipped over and I would have liked to read more about it. In the end, a really great series. I can see myself rereading this sometime and I gave it 4 stars. Next I finished Hannu Rajaniemi's collected fiction and I've been slowly reading this and I finally read the final short story during January and completed this. I gave this collection 3 stars. There are a lot of different kinds of stories in here. Some are more hard science fiction, some are more mythical, some have touches of Finnish mythology. Like in most collections, there are some stories that I really like, some stories that I like less, and I think there's quite an abundance of different kind of stories here, so different kind of readers will most certainly like different stories in this. The reason I gave this 3 stars is because while I liked a lot of the stories while I was reading them, when I looked backwards at the book, I couldn't really remember a story that really stood out for me. So there wasn't this one that was amazing to me. Perhaps Topside and Deus Ex Homine were most interesting to me, but I really can't say. I'm also going to do another video about this book where I tell you how to pronounce the Finnish words and Finnish names that are used in all of these stories. A couple of days ago I was in a bookshop and I saw this little booklet of Neil Gaiman's How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, and this is a Neverwhere short story featuring Marquis de Carabas. And Neverwhere is one of my favorite books. It was the first urban fantasy book that I read as a teen, so it's pretty close to my heart. And Marquis de Carabas is one of my favorite characters, so of course I picked this one up. And I read this in about an hour in a coffee shop, and I really liked it. I felt really comforted. I felt sort of nostalgia at being back in the London below, in this world. I also instantly recognized the way that the Marquis talks. I just fell into that familiar rhythm. And I was a lot more into this than I was in The Sandman Overture, which was also one of Neil Gaiman's returns back to his old stories. And I thought I would have enjoyed the Sandman comic more, but it turned out I actually loved this. There was one thing that I'm not quite sure about how I feel. On the other hand, it was an interesting another facet to the personality of Marquis de Carabas, about his history, but in another hand, I felt like it took away a bit from the Marquis' character. So there was one thing that I wasn't quite sure about how I felt in this book, but I still gave it 5 stars. The next book I actually finished the 1st of February, but I'm going to show it now because I need to return it to the library. And that is Jim Butcher's Aeronaut's Windlass, their first book in the Cinder Spires series. This is steampunk fantasy series about a world where people live in these spires. So one spire is one country. And it's about a group of characters who are trying to foil a plot from another spire inside their own home spire. And on the surface, this was a great action adventure book, but it also felt quite bland and by the numbers for me. I enjoyed some parts of it, but I was never really that into it. There were some fun characters. I liked Gwen and Bridget and Benedict, and those were the characters that when they were introduced I sort of immediately knew what they were about and what their personality was like. But that wasn't true for Captain Grimm. The first chapters that he was in were more about the airships and less about him, and so I didn't really know what kind of a man he was. I knew he was a captain who liked his ship, and that was it. So when there were his chapters in the beginning, I was mostly bored during those and I wanted to know what the other characters were doing. There's also a cat character in this called Raoul, and I didn't mind the cat characters. I know some people didn't like them, but I found the cat to be quite a nice character. They are not exactly talking cats in this book, but some people can understand cat talk, so basically talking cats. And I didn't mind that at all, but I did mind it when there were some chapters from the cat's point of view. I think it would work better if the cat would only be a character in the human's point of view chapters, because it always just ends up reading too much like a human when an author tries to write an animal, in my opinion. What I really liked about this book was the villain, Madame Cavendish. She was a great villain. I love sharp-dressed villains, and she was most definitely that. She also has a great sense of threat about her. She's a really threatening villain. That really worked for me. The writing in this book was very readable, but some of the plot points felt a bit obvious, some of the storytelling a bit clumsy. It didn't feel like it was on the same level as his Dresden books. There were some things that I think were underlined too much, so I knew what was going to happen, and it took away the element of surprise from some plot points. Yeah, it was very readable, and I did finish it, and I was into some parts of it, but I also had a ton of nitpicks about it while I was reading it. One thing was that people say God in heaven on nearly every other page in this, especially during the latter half. Everyone says God in heaven all the time, and that repetition grew to be so annoying. Also, in the beginning, a lot of people are wearing waistcoats. Why not just write waistcoat, really? There was also a couple of things that were just suddenly introduced. I was left thinking, did I miss something? Were these things mentioned beforehand and I just missed them? Like, there was this one wagon that was suddenly talked about, and I didn't remember that I had heard about any wagon before that point. So, yeah. I also felt the ending was a bit drawn out. Okay, so it wasn't a bad book. I did give it 3 stars. It was a book that I read with some enjoyable parts. It didn't evoke any strong emotions in me. Let's say that. So let's just see how I did with the triple doc TBR there, which was only reading books that I owned before the end of the year last year. Well, I did buy How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, but I did read it in 1 hour, so I'm not counting that one. I only read 1 book of my own, The Dark is Rising, and the rest of the books were library books. Now, I did give myself permission to read library books that I had reserved before the end of the year, but I wasn't counting on all of them coming in at the same time. So these 2 came in. I have a couple of other books that I really need to read, and there are 2 other books that are just coming in that I need to get from the library. So reading my own books isn't going that well. I did manage to start Memory and Dream by Charles DeLint, one of his Newford novels, and I read about 120 pages of it, and I hope to continue it in February. And I really like it so far. It's a story about an artist who has the ability to bring her paintings to life. It's not in a really great way. It's in a way that she paints something that some spirit recognizes itself in and approves of, and it brings the spirit over into the real world. So it's not really something that she does consciously. It's actually kind of scary. I'm really interested in how this continues. I also wanted to do more reviews this year. In January I did 1 review of the Gem comic, and now I'm filming this wrap-up, so I think I'm doing okay. So that's all for now. Let me know if you are planning on picking some of these books up, or if you've already read them, and I'll see you later.